Good evening. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm just going to do my own introduction. I told her I didn't need to put her through that. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, let me know. Louder? Okay, I'll talk louder. I don't know, can we turn volume up at all? Okay. And if I get too excited and talk too fast, just let me know and I will slow back down. My students are always telling me, slow down. So I will introduce myself first. My name is Dr. Jennifer Sterling. My students call me Jen. That is fine. Jen is fine. I was Jenny in high school during my basketball playing days. But I go by Jen now. I am a lecturer at the University of Iowa in the Sports Studies program. We are housed in the Department of American Studies. And so what I do is research and teach about sport and the culture of sport in the US in particular. So history, I talk a lot about women in sports. And so this particular topic has been close to me because of who I am as a researcher, but I also played 6-on-6 basketball and also played 5-on-5. I was one of the transition generation where I played 2 years in high school of 6-on-6 and 2 years of 5-on-5. So if you're quick with math, you can figure out when I graduated and how old I am. Where we will end today is talking about how in 1993 we played our last season of 6-on-6 girls basketball in Iowa. So I graduated in 1995. But we've been playing 6-on-6 basketball. We've been playing some form of basketball in Iowa since the early 1900s, late 1800s. We've hosted state tournaments since 1920. So we are the oldest continuous hosting of girls' state tournament anywhere in the nation. It is a long and storied tradition, and one I hope many of you have memories of and are willing to share with us as I kind of walk through the timeline tonight. So a little bit of background about me personally. I'm from Iowa originally. Hence playing 6-on-6. There's not a lot of states that played it as long as we did. I'm from Fremont, Iowa, which is near Ottumwa. Does anyone know? We have an Ottumwa native over here that I've already met. So southeast Iowa. And I went on and played college basketball at Central College in Pella, Iowa. So I was a Division III basketball player and coached in southwest Iowa near Audubon. Where I coached at Audubon, so if you're from the southwest area of Iowa, I sort of know that area a little bit as well. This particular project was initiated because the Iowa Women's Archives, which is housed at the University of Iowa, was celebrating its 25th anniversary, and that coincided with the 25th anniversary of the end of 6-on-6 girls basketball. So we decided to combine those two interests, and we built an exhibit that traveled throughout the state for about a year, a little bit longer than a year. And we were lucky enough to travel alongside a touring Smithsonian exhibit from DC that was talking about just the role of sport in communities, and particularly in sort of small towns. So this is just a little mini version of our exhibit. Do not expect you to be able to read all of the text here, but it's where a lot of the talk is derived from. So I like to give my co-conspirators here a shout out, as always. So Karin Mason is who I worked with at the Iowa Women's Archives. Susan Burrell, who is now Professor Emeritus of the Department of American Studies and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, and Tina Parrott, who was a professor in the Department of American Studies. All three have now retired and left me alone to continue the 6-on-6 research, but they were amazing to work with, and I loved learning from them, and learning from the touring that we did. So each town we took the exhibit to, we talked to people, we collected more for the archives, we learned more about the stories that people had to share about 6 on 6. Because even though we have a good collection of women in sport, girls and women in sport in Iowa, we have so much more to learn. And so anytime I come out and do these talks, I love hearing about your experiences because they are experiences I haven't heard about yet. So please do share when I open it up. And we have a microphone we can pass around as well. And please also feel free to raise your hand or just shout out questions at any point. This doesn't need to be a formal presentation. Just a quick show of hands, how many people, or a nod of heads, how many people have heard of the Iowa Women's Archives before? Fantastic. So I won't spend too much time talking about them, but it's an amazing repository of history about women in Iowa, whether it's about sporting women or rural women. They've had a number of really focused collecting initiatives. So the Mujeres Latinas is about Latina women in Iowa. We've had special collecting efforts around African American women's history, around Jewish women, and the Rural Women's collecting initiative that you see in the middle is where we actually have the most information about girls' participation in sport. So as I get into the history here, we'll see that early on there were a lot of girls that played in a lot of different types of towns, but as 6 on 6 develops, as basketball becomes more popular, the big cities drop it. And so it's the rural towns that continue the legacy of girls basketball in Iowa until the 70s and 80s when Title IX starts prodding the participation of some of those larger schools. So in addition to the Rural Women's Collection, we also have quite a bit of sporting information because the University of Iowa had one of the first in the nation Department of Physical Education for Women. And so this kind of coincides as well with support for girls participating in sports and physical activity, girls sweating and exercising, which wasn't always seen as the appropriate thing to do. But since we housed these physical educators and we were educating them here in the state of Iowa, and they then went out and became teachers and coaches, we do see a bit more support early on in Iowa for the participation of girls in sport. The last thing I want to mention is I am not the end-all be-all expert on this. There are so many people, scholarly and otherwise, that have written lots and lots of great information. I was admiring this book over here, which I have an image of over here as well. So Janice Barron, who's Iowa State faculty, has researched and written on this extensively, and we have her collection of these research efforts in the archives. But this has also been written about in scholarly books and articles. There's a play called 6 on 6. Has anyone seen the 6 on 6 play? Yeah, it's a great play. It was, when we were touring the exhibit, one of the towns put it on. So there is that exists as well. So there's been a lot of thinking about this, a lot of research on this, a lot of memorializing. And in particular, 2022 was the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And so there was a lot of conversations about the history of women's sport and a lot of a renewed interest in 6 on 6 girls basketball. So we will kind of go back and start at the beginning and talk a little bit about why basketball, how it was modified for girls, how it became popular in Iowa. But mostly I'll be telling stories that we know about the experiences of girls in 6 on 6 basketball based on the records we have in the archives. So kind of telling history through these personal stories. So before I get started with that, this is usually the part of the talk that I will say that I will do a deep dive into whichever community I'm going in to sort of speak to. But I figured we had lots of communities represented here. So I'm kind of curious to know where you're all from and how many former 6-on-6 players, coaches, supporters, etc. that we have in the room that will kind of help me tailor the talk a little bit as well. So I'm just going to do some polling here. How many people have played 6-on-6 basketball? Fantastic. How many people have been to state? Well, yeah, a few. The state girls basketball, yeah, the state tournament, yes, the state tournament. Okay, so one thing that we find when I talk to people in communities is that often the histories we have, or that we have collected, or that people think are worthy of collecting, are those that are the star athlete or the athletes that went to state. Where in reality, it's the everyday experiences we're interested in as well. So state or no state, just trying to make sure. Usually there's like some hidden 6-on-6 star in the audience, and I don't find out until afterwards, and everyone else knows. So trying to feel you out. Okay, so how many were from towns that were? How many of you grew up in towns that were maybe 1,000 people or less? Okay, all right. Yeah, Fremont is 700 people, so I'm right there with you. And then how many grew up in larger towns that were maybe 10,000 or more? Okay. So one interesting thing, the hometown teams exhibit that we toured with, the Smithsonian considers a town of 25,000 or more small. And I thought that was really interesting in Iowa because our small means something a little bit different. Okay, so that helps me there. We'll get to some maps later, and I would like to hear from some people then too about where maybe you were in Iowa. So I'm just going to start with the history. I have a number of these slides that have arrow across the top. Can everyone see these okay? Do we need to turn down brightness or okay. So yeah, any of the slides with the arrow, I'm just trying to provide a timeline of when things happened and what was going on where. So basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith. This is maybe a story that everyone knows, maybe not. But it happens in Springfield College in Massachusetts, and the story goes something like he nailed up some peach baskets, and the rules changed frequently in the beginning. But just down the road, a year later, Cinda Berenson at Smith College was like, well, we'd like to play too. But at the time, there was a lot of thoughts about what women should be doing and what was appropriate for them to do with in regards to physical activity. So they modified the game into a 3-court game. Yeah, so the men's game has always been a 2-court game with 5 players, although the number of players have changed some. But what Cinda said is we're going to put more people on the court, and we're going to divide up the court so that women don't have to move so much, right? So it was a 9-player 3-court game, but very, very popular. So by 1896, just 4 years later, the first women's college basketball game is played between Stanford and UC Berkeley. So like many college sports in the early 1900s, or like many sports in the early 1900s, they got their origin, they had their start in college. So we see these college women playing. So more than 500 girls and women attended the event, but men were not allowed. So it was one thing to let the women play, but it was another thing to allow men to see the women behave in such a manner, right? So sweating and exerting themselves and possibly turning bright shades of red. And I know we all kind of laugh about it a little bit now, but this was it was a social norm at the time. So in Iowa, we know at Iowa State University we have evidence as early as the 1890s of people playing recreationally, of women playing competitively. You'll note the uniforms, like as we kind of progress through the years, they're going to change quite a bit. So kind of pay attention to that as we go along. I wanted to show you, so this is a diagram of the three-court game. So if you're wondering how they divide a court up into three equal parts, this is what it looks like. So the center line is, I kind of think about this a little bit like soccer, how you can have the midfield players and they have a little bit more room to move, but they still have forwards on one side and guards on the other side, which is what we come to know as 6-on-6 basketball. They still had limited dribbles, which is the way that 6-on-6 basketball was played here. And but the centers, we've heard a number of different stories about what the centers could and could not do. So some people have told us they could run the entire court. Some people have told us they had to stay in that center space and they were just the transition from the forwards to the guards. Has anyone experienced playing three-court ball? Yeah? Oh, great. Yeah, I was going to say, so granny basketball is a form of basketball that's been sort of revitalized in Iowa and some Midwestern states, but was started here, and they adopt the three-court game. Yes?
My mother played the center court.
Uh-huh.
She was in high school in Wyoming.
Oh, okay.
They played three-court.
Yeah, so he was saying that his mother played the center court, and it was a three-court game, but in Wyoming. Yeah.
My mother played this game in Iowa, and she told me they weren't allowed to, the centers had to stay in the middle.
Okay.
It was thought to be unhealthy for women to run that much.
Yes, correct. Yes.
They were fragile, you know.
Yes, very fragile. Very fragile species. One of the things I'll sort of talk about, especially, these myths around women's frailty and harm to reproductive organs exist well into the mid-1900s. So we'll continue to see kind of conversations that happen about that. The other thing I wanted to point out, it's far too small to make out here, but it talks about how much space you have to have between the end line and the wall, and it's 2 inches. So the end or the sidelines had to have at least 2 inches between the obstacle and the line. So again, I'm sure some of you have had experiences playing in gyms. So early on, they had to play around potbelly stoves in the middle of the court. At my school gym, we had a stage, and if you went out of bounds to get a ball, you kind of ended up with your midsection jammed onto the stage. So does this sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, what was your court, or maybe somewhere you traveled to play?
We played several places where there was a stage,
Mm-hmm.
and if you ran out of bounds, you went off the stage.
Oh.
Into the stage. And the other thing was if you had big feet and you had to keep your feet out of bounds to throw a ball.
Yes.
With 2 inches, it was kind of.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes they made like concessions. So I'm a size 12 foot, and so my feet were really hard to. They weren't quite so big in high school, but they were really hard to get back behind those 2-inch lines. Yeah, so this is what the three-court game looks like. So this is played until the 30s. This is the version of sports. So when we talk about the girls' state basketball tournament in Iowa starting in 1920, or the high school sports that led up to that, we're talking about the three-court game until the 30s. And that's a national type of standard. So I'm sure there was some advance of that and some a little bit later than that. But in general, we know the three-court game was played until the 30s. Okay, so one of these personal stories. Yeah, this is like one of my favoriteest photos of all time. And I'm using a cheat sheet on my phone, so I promise I'm not texting up here. This is my favorite for lots of reasons. Usually we see very formally posed teams and photos this early. So this is 1918 Forest City girls basketball team. And this is the Melinda Hoos Mason papers. This is a relative of Karen Mason, who is now an emeritus archivist at the archives. So this is kind of a personal story as well. So not only is her collection there, but the family has also done a lot of really rich historical, like newspaper research and that type of things that accompany what we know about the personal stories. So in 1918, they were having a better season, but like research in the newspapers talk about like how the coach took them out to the movies to inspire better play, and how they played much better after they all went to the movies together. The research also talks about, and again, just some images that sort of show, they had a very nice gym. Very nice gym compared to some of those courts I was talking about before. And then the picture on the right with the domestic science classroom, there's a story in the newspaper talking about how the basketball players, the girls' basketball team was so popular that during their end-of-season banquet, which is something that kind of goes along with high school basketball, especially girls' high school basketball, that they had people break into those windows that you can see up above there. They had boys break into those windows to try to, get a chance to talk to the girls. So there was a lot of reporting early on. So what we see now currently is a lack of reporting on women's sport and girls' sport. But what we saw earlier was a lot of reporting on their daily happenings, their practices, their games, the break-in at the banquet, right? And they also, there's this amazing poem that I want to read that is also about this girls basketball team. So I'll pull the picture back up. It was written in the Forest City Summit, and so Forest City up in north central Iowa. So this is to the girls, it's titled, and it goes, "The Hooses and the Browns, besmeared with grime and mud, go gallantly in to get the ball and quit all bathed in blood. A Jensen knocks a Reagan down and kicks her in the chest. The high school girl is carried home and gently laid to rest. While here and there a little freshie collapses 'neath the pile, and the undertakers get more business than they've had in quite a while." So I like the poem was written in 1917, and it really speaks to how physical the game was, despite these modifications that allowed for the frailty of girls and women's bodies. So obviously they were playing a different style of game than maybe what was intended. So in 1920, we have our first state girls basketball tournament, and it's Correctionville versus Nevada, and Correctionville wins. And then in 1925, the Iowa High School Athletic Association, which is now affiliated only it used to govern both boys and girls sports. So in 1925, they vote to discontinue sponsorship of the girls' state basketball tournament, so 5 years into the history. And there's a lot of reasons this happens, but there's a larger national movement at the time that is saying a couple of things. Primarily that girls shouldn't be participating in sport that's dangerous for their bodies. And to protect them, we need to remove those activities. The other reasoning, however, though, came from kind of a surprising source. So thinking more about women's physical educators. They were concerned that competitive sports made it so that sports were only available for some girls and not all girls. And so it was more of a kind of sport for all movement, but it contributed, they contributed to the same result, that opportunities for girls were greatly reduced in the 1920s. So what happens here in Iowa is kind of reflects what's going on across the US at the time. So in 1926, just for context, organizations like the Amateur Athletic Union sort of step in and say, well, if all of you people aren't going, if school's not going to provide sporting opportunities, or things like the YMCA aren't going to provide sporting opportunities, we, the AAU, will provide sporting opportunities for girls. And so they start sponsoring like a national basketball championship. But you'll see in 1927, we have a new organization all of a sudden. It's the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union. And this is in response to the Iowa High School Athletic Association no longer willing to sponsor girls' sports. And really at the time, it was girls' basketball. There wasn't a huge variety of sports for girls offered at the time. So the way this comes about is that when they have this vote, 1925, there's a number of rural high school principals and superintendents that say, oh no, we will keep offering this for our girls. And that's where we start seeing the split for rural girls participating in sport, in basketball in particular, and girls in bigger schools are then not offered that same opportunity. So small schools, rural locations are continuing to play sports, in particular basketball, and the larger schools in more urban locales are no longer offering sports. There is something called the Girls Recreation Association that was active at the larger schools. So think of it as like intramurals. So you could participate in like play days or scrimmage against each other, but you would never really travel or compete. Yeah. So I saw a couple of nodding heads with the Girls Recreation Association. Okay. So yeah. Moving on then. Some of these timeline slides, I just want to give you some context of what's going on elsewhere in the world or elsewhere in the US. So the 20s are a time where women are gaining a lot more freedom, and we see that spill over into sports with the introduction of women were allowed in the Olympics in the early 20s. So they started their own Olympics. And we see stars like Helen Wills Moody start kind of dominating tennis, especially the more sort of feminine sports. Swimmer Gertrude Ederle swims the English Channel. She's the first swimmer to do the American crawl across the channel, and she does it far faster than any man that's done it before her. I like to add those footnotes as well. So by 1928, the Olympics have said, oh yes, let's invite women to participate, but they've limited the events they can participate in. And one event they do allow women to participate in is the 800. Has anyone run an 800 before? It's a long ways. I ran 800s in high school. I got very tired after them and sometimes laid on the grass next to the track. So that's what happens with these women. They lay on the track, exhausted, and the Olympic organizers take it as a sign that that is evidence that women are not capable of running such a distance. So they don't actually run that distance in track events until 1960s again. And the marathon's not added until 1984 for women. So again, just the way that we're seeing some restrictions for women at the same time that they are gaining more, that they're gaining more freedoms and more opportunities. And then I just also want to point out the Tuskegee Institute, which is a historically black university in Alabama, forms a women's track team and begins offering scholarships. So often we don't hear in women's history about scholarships until Title IX is passed in the 1970s, but here's an example of that happening early on. So there were, people were looking for opportunities to give women. Okay, so some more stories. This is Gwen Johnson. She's from Newhall, and Newhall was one of the towns that decided to stop offering basketball. But Gwen didn't believe that that's what should happen, and so her and her friends got together and they rode their horses from farm to farm and they collected signatures. And just a few years later, in 1927, they win the state basketball tournament. So this is, yeah, these pictures are from her album. So lots of like scrapbooks and albums come in that have lots of, really rich stories to share. And this is Gwen here in the basketball photo. I have a little bit more background on this one too. So they play in Centerville. And Centerville's a long ways away for them. And, but they play, so this is a time when the state tournament is a round robin tournament and they go from different towns, they move it to different towns each year. So this one was in Centerville. They play Sioux Center, which was even further away. And there were very few fans that could get there, so they hired a phone in a local place back in Newhall. But the only phone in Centerville was outside of the gym. So they would have to go into the gym to figure out what was going on, and then come back to the phone to call Newhall. And so I think in the timeline it says like the first broadcast game of the state tournament is much later, but I kind of consider this one of the first. So they actually trailed by double digits at halftime, and they made this ferocious comeback. And so by the time they got to the phone to update them again, Newhall had won. And so it was very exciting, very thrilling. And we also have lots of photos like this. So this is the town welcoming Newhall back after winning the state championship. And it says, she talks about how the team was met by a band and a cheering crowd. And there was a poem recited, and they just, they talk about the whole town came out to celebrate their victory. And we also we have lots of photos and stories of, and we were talking about one earlier, about how the entire town shuts down to go support the girls playing at the state tournament, that post offices aren't open, and like the lengths that these towns, these small communities went to support their girls playing basketball. We've also heard stories of how brothers or fathers or mothers did chores for the girls so they could get to practice and participate in girls basketball. So there was a lot that went on to make these happen. It was a really big community building event. So whether it was, again, just playing basketball or a state tournament, the towns really turned out for support. So this is another person's collection we have. So this is Sarah Eileen White, Longchamp. She is from Ida Grove. So they are the state champions in 1928. The upper right, or the upper left corner for you, this is her as well when she was a mascot on her her older sister's basketball team. So it was pretty common to have like a younger brother or younger sister as a mascot. And then that's her in the the team photo. So she had an extensive diary that she kept, and some of those diary entries were about her participation in basketball. And so she had some ticket stubs here. She tells the story of going to Perry to play at the state tournament, and how many times they had to get out and push the car out of mud because the roads were so horrible. She calls it gumbo mud. She also talks about when they got to Perry, there were a number of nice young men with nice cars offering them rides. And teams usually travel with chaperones, and so I've always wondered, she never talks about where the chaperone was, but I always wonder where the chaperone was during all this, because they decide to get in one of the cars, and they go riding, and another car starts chasing them, and they get stuck in mud again, and so it wasn't all just about basketball, it was about the experience of traveling to these games, of getting to participate in things like the state tournament. And then I love this last entry. I've blown it up here, but again, I don't expect everyone to make it out. My students always say, I can't read cursive. And so one of the things I've started doing in some of my classes is making them translate or transcribe these so that we have these easily readable for whoever needs them read. Text, because the diaries, they are sort of, we need to preserve them because they won't always be around to read. So anyway, she talks about how she hated leaving Perry and all the good-looking men, and then the final line, it says, "It matters not if you won or lost, but how you played the game. Only we won." So again, this idea that girls or women were maybe not interested in competing or being competitive is really offset by that type of writing. Like, she was highly competitive and very proud of her accomplishments. So I'm going to wrap up the 1920s here with a conversation about Gwendolyn Johnson-Hyde. So this is the same New Hall team that we saw earlier with our other Gwen. And this is her in the front row. She goes on to be a coach. And so this is her with the teams that she coached. She coached at Whitten. I'm sorry. So this picture is from Gwendolyn Johnson-Hyde, but this is Melba Gardeman, who is in that photo, and then the coach here. And it's just an example of an early scorebook. The scores were really low early on, so sometimes in the teens or the 20s. And again, as 6-on-6 basketball hits its heyday, the Fords would have 60 points, 100 points. But very low scoring in the beginning. So she coached at Whitten, and and these are just some of the candid photos of the team. You can see, girls really enjoying being part of these teams and playing basketball. And you also see the evolution of uniforms. We're getting shorter, we're showing more skin. They're getting more comfortable to wear. And she also coaches at Conrad. And I like to point her out as an example of women coaches, because one thing that we don't have a strong history of in Iowa is women coaching girls basketball. So it's been primarily men that have coached girls and women's basketball, girls basketball in particular. So I like to check every once in a while to see if we have any more women entries into the Basketball Coaching Hall of Fame for girls sports. And so far we only have one. So in all the years that we've played girls basketball in Iowa, we only have one Hall of Fame coach that's a woman. So there were some barriers to women coaching. When she was married, she had to stop teaching and coaching. It was like part of her contract. It was a clause in her contract that she could no longer pursue those professions. So that was quite a barrier for women being longtime coaches. Okay, so the 1930s, we start seeing, we'll see this transition to the 2-court game or 6-on-6 girls basketball. So the state tournament started at the field house, then started touring to different sites, and then went back to the Drake Field House. It obviously moves to what we affectionately know as the Barn eventually in Veterans Memorial Auditorium. And then the other thing we see is we see it move from a 4 to 8 qualifier and from a round robin to like the quarterfinal, semifinal consolation. So when you look at the historical records, it looks quite different. And then in 1934, it moves to 16 qualifiers, and that's how it stays until 1994, until the end of 6-on-6 girls basketball. I know, I'm always like, I thought the same thing when I found that. I was like, really? So we don't go to classes. We're 1A through 5A classes now, and we don't go to classes until after the end of 6-on-6. But it used to be the 16 best teams, no matter where you came from, no matter how big your school was, and it was just the 16 best teams. And then, of course, I had to put something about a snowstorm in the state basketball tournament because there's this myth, although it's been disproven with research and statistics and weather maps. There's a myth around bad weather in the girls' state tournament. So this, for example, talk about how they had to battle the bad weather and how it becomes the first live broadcast because of that. Okay, so this is where the 2-court game comes into play. So I just put the 2 diagrams next to each other there, and this is the close-up then of what the 2-court game looks like. So we had so many people that played 6-on-6. Again, I will not belabor this point, but sometimes I have an audience of like 12-year-olds, and I'm like, okay, so you couldn't move. They're like, you couldn't move? You had to stay, yes, forward stand on that side, guard stand on the other. So we in Iowa played with a limited dribble. So we had a 2-dribble rule in Iowa. In Texas, which plays well into the 70s as well, they play an unlimited dribble. So there used to be this game that happened between Iowa and Texas, and it was always really hard for Iowa to win because they played with the unlimited dribble, and we were used to 2 dribbles. So sometimes I hear those stories about how difficult that was. Moving into thinking about what this next phase looks like. So this happens in 34. Other things happening in the 30s and 40s. Again, we're seeing, especially post-World War, we're seeing more opportunities for women, or especially during the war, we're seeing more opportunities for women. So the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League is created. And then what we're starting to see, and we were talking about this earlier as well, like factories started having teams, or like where women were working, we're offering sports as like recreational opportunities. So we start seeing some opportunities there for women as well. This is the same one, right? Yeah, she was showing me one of these earlier. So this is a basketball yearbook down on the right, and I'll have some more images from these later. So the 50s and 60s are really considered the heyday of 6-on-6 basketball in Iowa. It's when a number of things happen. Importantly, it's when Ewayne Cooley is named executive director of the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union. And he really decides to make it a show. So the tournaments move to Veterans Memorial Auditorium. It seats 15,000, which frequently sells out. We start seeing the first live television broadcast of it. And because of the popularity of basketball, the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union is able to add a significant amount of new sports. So we start ushering in this era of the multi-sport athlete, which we really haven't had before because they didn't have these opportunities. just to kind of build on those heydays, right? So there's a couple like big events that people really talk about, and if I leave them out of this talk, I always hear that those things happened. So 59 was another one of those snow events, and everyone got stuck in Veterans Auditorium. And so DJ Frosty Mitchell brings his equipment over, and they turn the tournament into this like sock hop. I was talking to someone the other day that had actually been there for it, and he was like, "No, I just slept on the benches." So not everyone was up for that, but they were all stuck there because of the weather. And then in 1968, the quote-unquote game of the century between Jeanette Olson's Everly Cattle Feeders and Denise Long's Union Witten Cobras. So this is a game, again, that's battled with both of the star forwards really having high-scoring games. And I actually presented a talk at Everly over the summer, and it was really interesting to kind of hear Everly's take on this story. So the yearbooks, I want to talk about just a little bit. I'm very aware of time, and I want to finish up so we have time to just chat if you'd like. So the yearbooks were a place where they documented all the teams that came to state. So kind of like a yearbook, like you would get for your school year. But it was also a place where Ewing Cooley really formed what it was like to be an Iowa girl. He always talked about his Iowa girl. And that was someone who was very community-minded, very involved, very academically sound, but also feminine, right? And so there would be these parts in the yearbook that would talk about etiquette, hygiene, manners, and then there were also these like scientific or pseudoscientific articles where he would really fight to go against some of these myths around girls being able to participate physically. So again, the middle here is an article about, it calls, the main title is Evidence Proves Girls Able to Take Basketball in Stride. So it seems a little bit cringy now, but at the time he was really trying to take scientific evidence and say to people, I have evidence that girls can participate in these sports and not have any harm done to their body. The little byline underneath talks about how girls are 70% as strong as boys. And again, he was trying to make an argument for girls participating in sports. But yeah, it hasn't aged well necessarily. But so the yearbooks served a number of purposes. So in the 50s and 60s, again, we see more progress, and we start seeing a lot more activism and advocacy for women participating in sports. So if they were not being allowed to participate, they were starting to shove their way in. And so we see like the Ladies Professional Golf Association, or the LPGA, is formed during this time. We see the first women run the Boston Marathon, although the first two women that run it have to do under the guise of people not knowing that they were women. So Kay Switzer registered without her first name, Catherine, and the woman that ran it first actually ran alongside of the main course. And then we also start seeing the rise of really prominent African American women athletes like Althea Gibson and Wilma Rudolph. And so it's not until 76 that women's basketball is added to the Olympic program. And in 71 is when the nation switches to 5-on-5 girls basketball. So except for Iowa, Tennessee, Texas, and Oklahoma. So Tennessee and Texas both switch later in the 70s, and Oklahoma switches after us in 1995. So 2 years after we do. So I'd like to point out that 5-player rules were adopted for girls basketball prior to the passage of Title IX. So this was something that was not initiated. So a lot of people point to the demise of 6-on-6 girls basketball and like to point make a direct link between Title IX and the demise of 6-on-6 girls basketball. But those rules were changing even before it was passed. So the other thing we're starting to see in Iowa, just some examples of some stories from the 60s and 70s. So this is a story of Jane Rubel, Jane Christopher Rubel. And so she's a player in 1971 that sues Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union because she gets married and has a child and is no longer allowed to play basketball. So there was a rule in the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union that disallowed that, but there was no equivalent rule for boys. So boys could be married, boys could have a family, and they could still play, but girls could not. She wins the lawsuit, or Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union makes the change. And again, I've heard stories over the years of her return. That she was a very good player, so the teams were kind of hoping the rule would stand, because this meant she could come back and they would have a good team. But there was a lot of support for it. Her files, her records at the archives have lots of letters that were written to her from all over the state and from all over the nation, really. So there was a lot of support for these changes. This is Julie Goodrich from Adele. I just like to point out that she's a multi-sport athlete, so again, this is kind of this era of increased opportunities where she was playing and excelling at multiple sports across multiple seasons. I also like to point out that the amazing typing that someone did in all of their photos make it exceptionally easy to do research in the archives. But I had a chance to meet her, and I told her that I loved how her mother did that for her. And she said, that was my father. So I learned, but again, it speaks to how committed families really were to these experiences. I always feel remiss if I don't mention the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. So after Title IX was passed, when we were starting to see an increased opportunity for collegiate play for girls in basketball and other sports, the NCAA was not interested in supporting women athletes. And so instead, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, it was already in place, and it was very active in making sure those opportunities happened for women long before the NCAA realized that women could be an opportunity as well in women's sports. A couple more slides and we'll just talk about the end, how it all ends in 1993. So the final story around, this is Machine Gun Molly Bolin. She's played at Moravia. And she was also one of the first people drafted to the Iowa Cornets, which was a short-lived professional basketball team, professional women's basketball team here in Iowa, between the late 70s and the early 80s. This is one of the publicity photos. So one of the ideas early on with women's sports was people wouldn't be interested unless they sort of sold it. And one way that they sold it was sort of to recruit attractive women to play and then sort of use them for publicity, which again, unfortunately, is still something that sometimes happens in women's professional sports. So the final push I'll talk about is what happens in 1983 when 3 students, 8th graders and freshmen in high school, sue the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union for the right to play 5-on-5 basketball. So this is what really marks the demise of 6-on-6. So in response to that, in 1985, the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union says, schools can decide if they want to play 5-on-5 or 6-on-6. So we start seeing a split. And this happens about the same time that Title IX is having to be enforced by the bigger schools. So they can no longer say, oh, we're just not going to give girls opportunities. So what starts to happen, I'm going to skip ahead to this slide. So what starts to happen is we see big schools playing 5-on-5, and we see small schools playing 6-on-6, because small schools have always played 6-on-6. And big schools are just starting to play and offer basketball. And so as they start to offer, they choose the 5-on-5 option. So this is a map of that 85 to 93 time frame, and when people switched to 6-on-6. So the blue dots, which are mostly small dots, are the towns that continue to play 6-on-6. The size of the dots are how big the towns are. So the bigger the dots, the bigger the town. You'll see most of the big dots are red. Red indicates they switched to 5-on-5. So this is this is kind of this intersection of all these different changes happening at once. All right, so one thing that we do see with that change is we see a more diverse population of girls playing basketball, with more larger schools and diverse counties and communities participating. So we start seeing our first African American inductees into the Girls Basketball Hall of Fame here, and players like Tanya Warren, who goes on to coach at UNI, becoming very prominent. And then these are photos from the 1993 Girls State Basketball Tournament, and the final, the hoop scoop, so what they kind of went to after the yearbooks. And so in 1993 is the last year. Cooley often talks about how he only did it for the girls. It's when it reached a point where all of the girls, or the majority of the girls, wanted to play 5-on-5, and that's why they eventually completely made the switch. It wasn't any legal pressure or cultural pressure, that it was the athletes themselves that really made that decision for him. And then just a follow-up timeline, like, where have we gone from here? Jean Berger is now the executive director of the Girls High School Athletic Union, and she's the first woman executive director. I've pointed out the Granny Basketball League, which was started in 2005. We had our first sustainable women's professional basketball league started in 1996. Oklahoma wraps up their 6-on-6 girls basketball, and Connie Schaefer, who I was talking about earlier, she's the first woman coach inducted, and still the only, into the Iowa Girls Coaches Association Basketball Hall of Fame, and happens in 2004. All right, so that is the end. So thank you so much. And I'm sure you all have things to go do. I'm happy to hang out and just have individual conversations, or if anyone wants to share before they take off, that's fine as well. But thank you again for your extended attention. Yes, please go ahead.
Have you ever met Kari Wolf?
I've not. Do you know
She's a
them?
friend of ours.
Really? I would love to meet.
She's a doctor in Springfield, Illinois.
Really? We'll have to talk. Can I get your contact information? Yeah, I've always, one of my classes, I assign my students different people for them to look up, to learn just a little bit, but she's always someone I assign, and they're always like, who's this? I've never heard of this. And great. No, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah.
Several stories and comments.
Yeah, please.
First of all, our daughter had 19 rebounds in the game out in West High here when she was playing 6-on-6 girl basketball.
That's a lot.
And they, just 2 years later, all that was out of the trophy case. It was all 5-on-5 instead of 6-on-6. Anyway, I was in Winfield, Iowa for a few years playing. I did the public address announcing for the basketball games. And one of the great players there was a sister, had 7 sisters. There were 8 Krieger girls that played there. And she was the mother of Jess Settles. Steve Settles played for the boys too. Anyway, one of the reasons that we only got to the state tournament one year was because of Mediapolis.
Yeah.
Is Heather Heddens here tonight?
No, but we ran into Heather.
Pierce is Heather's sister.
Yeah.
if you know her.
Roxine, yeah,
Yeah.
Roxine is Heather's sister, older
Yeah.
sister.
Okay?
We have run into Heather in a couple of places, and she has generously donated a few things to the archives. But yes, hers is a great story. And we've often heard, you know, towns like Everly, towns like Minneapolis, they're like, please just, I don't want to have to go through them to get to state. But they had so many different runs. It wasn't just one run, it was always a team that was good. But Minneapolis was definitely one of them. They always had those striped uniforms.
Non dessert.
I
Yeah.
don't know how many of you know Rosemary Friedrich that lives in town. She was the leading scorer in six-girl basketball in the 50s sometime.
So
Dave Jepson here was from Allison, Bristol, which was a state champion I don't know how many times. And I have one trivia story.
yeah, please.
I walked into the Dubuque Senior Gym to watch my daughter play in 1979. And 25 years to the day, I walked in there to play against Dubuque Senior for Burlington High. And the trivia question is, who was the 26-year-old coach of Dubuque Senior that year, 1954?
I don't know that.
Johnny Orr.
Oh, very interesting.
Hey, if you want another trivia,
Yeah.
I played basketball with Fuller's daughter out in Westside.
So did Al Hood's daughter, Ginger. Who
Right here, right here.
Yeah.
It's me, Ginger. You know how you say the basketball, the game, but it's the experiences and the friendships. I had a great friendship with your dog.
I just one
Yeah,
thing
please.
I'd like to say. I played girls basketball like this in Pennsylvania in 1951, 52.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure how widespread that was in Pennsylvania. But the second thing I want to say is about 30 years ago in Southeast Junior High, there was a mass meeting about, I don't have all of this right, I was there, about how are we going to afford the girls' uniform. And there was a male, I don't know who he was, who just stood up and said, it's so easy, they just sew their own. And it reminded me in 1951 of what girls in my high school outside of Pittsburgh came to my house. Someone had brought their sewing machines, I had one, and we made all our uniforms. And I'll just tell you one more story.
Yeah, please.
My coach was married to a linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Johnny Carsus. And he had a lot of time on his hands. So he would come and yell and scream at us at our practices. And one day, he actually followed me into the locker room yelling and screaming at me the whole time because I wasn't listening to him. I wasn't a very good player. I was a guard. I was scared after. Yeah, but that's my memory, is Johnny Carson's, following me into the.
Yeah. I have both seen and heard a lot of stories about the sewing that took place for the uniforms and the ironing that took place, especially for those pleated skirts. So I've heard a lot of those stories, and it's something, my students continue to write reflections on their own experiences, and they still talk about how they have to wear, they get new uniforms every 4 years, and the boys teams get them every year or something like that. Like a lot of those conversations kind of still happen, unfortunately, with the sewing comment. I did also want to say that it's unfortunate that they put away the 6-on-6. Lots of times those histories kind of live together. So the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union has a really dense collection of records, and it's still this hoop scoop, but it is available online, and I think it's 100 pages, but they have a 5-on-5 record book and a 6-on-6 record book, but they have them all together. They haven't sort of said, well, this history doesn't matter anymore. So yes, there's still a lot of that. Yes.
I remember the days when the state tournament included a free throw shooting contest.
Yeah.
And the girls worked their way up from sectional upstate to state, which led me to this question.
Mm-hmm.
Because the free throw is uncontested, it's standardized 15 feet from the hoop, and you can choose any way you wish to shoot. Is there any evidence that to support or refute this notion that girls were better free throw shooters than boys?
I mean, biologically, no.
No, I mean,
But
the numbers.
the numbers, yeah.
You've got the data somewhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of people would say that there's been more of an emphasis on technique and skill in the women's game, and because of that, they are often better shooters, especially with things like free throws. But it's interesting you mentioned the free throw contest, because I just said that the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union keeps really good records, but that is something they don't have in their records. Yeah. So I've been at a couple of places over the last year that have given me like their information, and I'm sure that the union still has it somewhere, but they don't have it accessible. It's not publicly accessible. So that's on my list of things to do, is like, where is that list? I mean, it's something that people really talk about and that towns are very proud of. Oh, we had a free throw champion. So yeah, I think that should be in the record books. Yeah.
The girls' basketball is smaller than the boys' basketball.
Mm.
Was it?
Yes.
It wasn't in our high school.
Well, it is in college.
Yeah.
We use the same ball.
Is it still true?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I would have to, so it depends on the level and there's different times where they play with the same ball and different balls, so yeah, that's a more, it's more back and forth of a history than you would think, but yes, I would have to look it up for sure. So there were different times where the boys maybe played, like, it was like quarters versus halves, that kind of thing. So there needed to be more stoppage time in the women's game, or it was a shorter game. But yeah, it's pretty standardized now. The three court is also a bit of a history trivia, and I can't remember, I looked it up once. I think it was in the 70s when it was added to the women's game. The girls' game didn't have the the three-pointer until like the 70s. So. Does that sound about right? They maybe shot from that far away, but they didn't get points for it. Yeah, it could have been even later than that, especially, again, like college versus high school. Someone was pointing this. Yes, go ahead.
Good job. For a small town called Emerson, Iowa. We were state runner-ups, and I must say that was one of the most exciting things because the whole Southwest Iowa supported us. We were flying and dining in Omaha, Des Moines. We had a trip to Okoboji. It was great, parades and everything. I mean, small towns really came together for the girls. It was kind of the Citadel team, which is state runner-ups. And we did also spend the night in the auditorium,
Yeah.
sleeping on bleachers.
Yeah. My mom played, and this kind of speaks to some of this generational conversation. Like 6-on-6 is a generational game. We've been playing it long enough in Iowa. There's great grandmothers and grandmothers and mothers and daughters, and so it's just they've continued on. But my mother talked about she never made it to state. Her team never made it to state, but her coach and the school principal were committed to making sure that the girls' team got to go travel to state and watch every year. And so I've heard a lot of people share those type of experiences as well. Even if they weren't participating, they got to go and stay in a hotel and go out to eat and watch the games and get their yearbook signed. Yeah.
I do have that yearbook.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
the screen.
Yeah.
That was the year that we went to the state.
Yeah. Yep. Yes, and I'm sure if you're willing to share, people would love to have a look. So, any other questions? I don't want to hold you. I know some people are probably just being polite and haven't got up and left yet, and you're welcome to take off whenever. Yeah, so thank you for your attention. I'll stay after. Please stop by and chat. Thank you.